Hi everyone, today we are going to talk about the rib stitch. A rib stitch is a combination of a knit and a purl stitch, so you get this effect. It's very elastic. This is a V shape on one side, so then you actually knit it as a knit stitch. Would you turn that now, then it becomes a purl stitch on the other side of your project. When you knit a project in just rib stitch, then you don't really have a right or wrong side. If you have this as for example a brim or cuff and you continue in another stitch, then you will get a right and wrong side again. If you knit on the loom, then you have 4 knit stitches, and from large to small these are E-wrap, true knit, U-wrap or flat knit. The use of your knit stitch actually determines the size of your rib stitches or individual rib stitches. The U-wrap is a fraction smaller than the true knit, and the true knit is actually a stitch as big as the purl stitch. So with the latter your knitting is actually nicely balanced. So by making your cuffs you can actually make it as elastic as you like by playing with those knit stitches. Now you see me using U-wrap as the knit stitch and a purl stitch as a rib stitch. And where the marker is, there's a purl stitch being knitted. I'm using a rather loose U-wrap so that the rib stitch will come out a bit nicer as well. In this way I wrap the yarn almost 3/4 around my peg. In most videos you can see that it is actually wrapped half around the peg, and that means that the U-wrap becomes tighter then. So you wrap the yarn almost 3/4 around it, around your peg, and you knit over, and then you go on to do your purl stitch and you knit that one too. On this channel you will also find another video about the rib stitch. The rib stitch can also be knitted with an E-wrap, of course, so you get an even bigger effect of the stitches or on the stitches. Here you see me demonstrating it as a rib stitch 1, and that's alternating 1 knit and 1 purl, but you can also knit it as a rib stitch 2 and then knit 2 knits and 2 purls. Something that is very nice with a rib stitch 1 is that you knit it with an odd number of stitches. A rib stitch is actually an even stitch, and because you use an odd number with your knitting, you start with a knit and then a purl and a knit and a purl, and then you end that row with a knit stitch. This could or can be useful in case of a brim or cuff for a sweater, and you knit it as a flat panel which you have to join later because it's a sleeve, so that you have the same stitch on both sides to join. And like I said, a rib stitch you can knit with all the knit stitches, and this is the one with a true knit. So you knit a purl, and that one you knit from the top of your stitch, and you knit a true knit stitch, and then you go and grab the stitch from below. And knitting this stitch, it's useful to use markers. How to adjust your rib stitch while or during your knitting. If you understand and know what a rib stitch look like, you'll notice that it's actually quite easy to adjust while knitting. When you see a V shape behind the back, you've knitted a purl stitch there. And then when you see a ridge behind your back, you know you've been knitting a knit stitch over there. And that knit stitch can be an E-wrap, true knit, or a U-wrap, or a flat knit. And that's handy because how often does it happen that you end up in the middle of your project and at that moment you know exactly which stitch you were knitting, but you were dragged or are dragged out because the phone rings or your children asks for something, and yes, of course you can start again. You know from the right side, I started with a knit one and then a purl, and then you start counting. But if you have a project with 100 stitches, that's a bit tricky. It takes a lot of time. Of course, you can mark your pegs as well, so it's a lot easier. Then you can do also the following. Especially in the beginning when you are doing this stitch, it is useful to check every time, like every 2 rows for example, if the V shapes are still underneath each other. And if the ribs are still underneath each other, then it's a little easier to fix it. It's easier to adjust after just 2 rows or when you have finished an entire project. So how can you fix those stitches or adjust your stitches? I will make some mistakes here on purpose, and then we will look together at how you can adjust that or it. So you have been knitting your project and then you have to quit. You have to wait for a moment. Okay, you tilt your loom, you rotate it. Here's your working yarn. So then you know you are going to knit that next peg. Here you see a ridge, then you know you were knitting a knit stitch, and then you can continue in pattern. Would you have seen a V shape, then you know that you were knitting the purl stitch. So now you can continue in pattern without having to count all the pegs, and within pattern I mean you're knitting a rib stitch of 1 knit 1 purl, and that's in pattern of the stitch. So this is at the time of knitting the stitch. After you have knitted the whole row, you can also check. You check if the V shapes are really V-shaped up to the back, and here you can see, for example, that the ridge don't continue, that you have accidentally knitted a purl stitch over here. Then you take the strand that is just under or below the back and pull it over the back, just with your working yarn and all the strands you see. Here you see a ridge where a V shape should be. You pull some at your fabric. If necessary, you grab that ridge and pull it over your back as well, very gently, and please take all the strands and bars with you, and you check the rest of your stitches and the rest of your row, and after knitting the stitch 100 times you really get used to it. You tilt or rotate the loom, you pull at the strands where you made that little mistake, and you bring that piece to the front. This is actually the yarn from your last row. So here you have knitted a purl stitch. You see that because you can see a V shape. So then the yarn goes down and then you grab the stitch from above. Just like you would have knit a purl, and you knit a purl stitch there. The same goes for the knit stitch. You see a ridge behind the back, and then you knit a stitch from the bottom. You take the yarn and you knit the stitch as you would normally knit it. And then you can check if necessary. Pull at your fabric so it's clearly visible, and now you see again all ridges where ridges should be, and V shapes where V shapes should be. Well, if everything goes as it ought to go, then you need a knit, a purl, a knit, etc. And you can do that repetitively, of course. There's also such a moment that you lose count, and then you can just, by tilting your loom, watch and look closely at what the stitches tell you. And you see where the working yarn is. You see a V shape there. So in case of a V shape, you were busy with a purl stitch, and with the ridge you were busy with a knit stitch. And then you can continue knitting this way without having to count everything all over again, if you are knitting without markers. Counting your rows can be done in two ways. Either you count all the V shapes, or you count your ridges. And then either you take the cast on stitch, or you count from the cast on stitch. The cast on stitch is the first ridge you see here. If you always do it the same way, that's the most important. And then you count the number of ridges up to the loom, and then you know how many rows you have knitted. And after you're knitting your project, you're going to give the stitch the right relaxation. Actually, you're going to pull it out or stretch it completely, and then the stitch will get its proper tension. And that is also what he or she should look like. The stitch has been rather pulled out, especially if you have knitted it with the U-wrap. So you pull it in the right proportions, and then you will leave it for a while. So far the tutorial on the rib stitch. Thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.